podcast for learning about affordable housing investment. And today I want to share with you a report that I kind of stumbled upon on LinkedIn. And this is specifically talking about how the Skid Row Housing Trust just collapsed, right? And this isn't like a business failed story, right? It's really the system is broken type of story. We're looking at this report called Redesign Required, where lessons for permanent supportive housing from Skid Row Housing Trust building. So this is interesting, right? They had their own study and they decided to look at everything about the Skid Row Housing Trust. And the Skid Row Housing Trust was primarily a way for it to provide a lot of housing for people that were formerly homeless, right? Now, these type of housing, right? Typically we heard as PSH or permanent support housing. They provide the roof, the wraparound, the social services, right? I mean, they were really successful in the beginning, but they filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. So let's try to explain this like we're in fifth grade, because I think that's really important. Now, the first problem is what I'm calling is the piggy bank problem, right? If you This is really around the limited partnerships type of structuring for all these deals. And imagine you were saving up money. You're a kid and you have a piggy bank and you have 29 piggy banks, right? In the normal world, if you have an empty piggy bank, but another is overflowing, like you would probably move some coins from that full piggy bank into the empty one, right? Well, in affordable housing, the law usually you can't do that, right? Each building was its typical own limited partnership, right? Its own piggy bank. So if building A made a profit, that money had to stay in building A with that piggy bank. But if building B lost money, right, the general partner or the trust in the scenario, they had to pay for the loss out of their own pocket. So you can't take money out of building A to pay off the losses in building B because technically there might have been different investors, different structure, etc. So as over time, they had to cover more and more losses. Now, the second problem is the rent versus the reality gap. And in most of these buildings, right, most of the money comes from government subsidies, right? Typically in the form of housing choice vouchers, project based vouchers, and a voucher, for the lack of better words, is simply a government subsidy that says the government will pay the rent of this unit for this tenant, right? Based off comparable properties. Now, you would think things like electricity, security, and insurance, right? Once they get more expensive, the government would pay more rent. Well, here is the spoiler, right? They didn't. Here's the flaw, right? Sometimes the rental rates were typically either frozen or they were based on old numbers from like a decade ago. So some buildings might have received like $500 less, $1,000 less per month than what a normal apartment would collect in terms of rent, right? Even during good years from like 2016 to 2019, the money coming in just wasn't coming. The money wasn't enough that was coming in to set aside for like a big repair, like putting on a new roof or fixing an elevator. And when you have that, it's not a good sign because then you just keep deferring repairs. You're kicking it down a road and eventually it comes to bite you. So here's the other problem. This is the acuity trap. This system prioritizes moving the most vulnerable people, right? Because those are the ones that get the priorities, right? These are the highest acuity folks with either medical, mental health needs, right, into these buildings. Now, it's a good mission, but it's very expensive, right? High needs, it means you need 24/7 security. You might need more repairs. You might be taking folks off the streets that have been on the streets for a long time and have no idea how to even take care of that property. I mean, I think I read that like, hey, one operator noted that turning over an apartment for a new tenant used to mean like a fresh coat of paint. That's typical what landlords do. But now they have to like strip the room down to the studs because of the damage, right? The security expenses jump from like 50 grand to like 1.4 million in just a few years. And that's going to be culminated with the vicious cycle of vacancy, right? This is the fourth problem. And when a room breaks, right, and there's no money to fix it because of what we just talked about earlier, because you didn't get enough rents, blah, 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 you didn't set in the reserves, it sits empty. Well, that empty room earns zero rent. When you can't take money from elsewhere to repair that rent, to get it back to a livable, rentable, safe, decent, clean type of condition, well, you can't rent it out. And by like 2022, I think like 30% of the units were empty. So this creates a downward spiral, right? Less rent, less money for repairs, more empty rooms. More empty rooms leads to even less rent. And that's, I mean, these are some big lessons. And I think what policymakers need to really think about is just what is that reset button, right? You have to connect the cost to your rents. We need like a reset button where subsidies can actually match what it costs to run a building today, not 20 years ago. Okay. And when you are looking at the market for comparable rents, you might be looking at a two-bedroom property for a normal building that serves a average to normal population. But when you have a high acuity type of residence, you can't use the same amount because you need more services. There's more expenses to operate that building, right? So you got to let policymakers understand, even though it's well intentioned, we have to think about it differently and learn to provide flexibility when the time comes. So, if you also allow a portfolio model, right? Earlier we talked about the piggy bank model where you can't let use piggy bank A to pay off piggy bank B, especially if piggy bank B is losing money. But you got to let owners share these resources between the buildings, right? So one bad year, one problem doesn't sink the whole ship, right? We learn some of the principles I learned from like listening to Tony Robbins, talking to Ray Dalio. All these folks talk about having diversification in their portfolio. And this is why people own multiple assets in multiple markets, et cetera, right? Because there's some diversification. You need to have that portfolio model because you can't let one bad apple sink the whole ship. You really can't do that. And finally, I think when a building struggles, government agencies should help fix the issues, right? Like putting rent in escrow for repairs instead of just cutting off funding, right? That downward spiral, right? When there were no money for repairs, the units sat empty because you can never find enough money to go repair the rooms, and then it just creates this downward spiral. You got to stop the downward spiral. Maybe you say, "Hey, I'll put in this money, this rent money, in escrow, so that it can only be used for repairs, so that you can get other units back online." So I mean, the bottom line is like you can't provide permanent housing if the finances aren't permanent too. And I think this was such an eye-opening type of report when you used to hear folks about how it cost 800 grand or $1 million just to build a unit, and you wonder why. It's not simply just the land or the cost; it's the all the other incentives that might incentivize developers to actually build the most expensive product so they can get the most amount of subsidy. And even once you get most amount of subsidy, you also have to be cost competitive. And when you're cost competitive, like how do you reduce your operating expenses, even though you know it's so needed to provide those services? But if you aren't operating efficiently, then maybe you're not as competitive and you don't score as many points for the project. And it's just well intentioned, but it can't be perfect. So I think really we need more flexibility. So hopefully it's helpful, but I just want to cover a little different of a topic today that I think is good for everyone to understand because it's never as straightforward, it's never as simple. And I hope you all can learn a little bit from this report and apply this towards your city, your county, your housing authorities, your own development projects, because I think this is it really highlights the risk. Sometimes we get so amped up over a groundbreaking, over a ribbon cutting, over a home opening day that we forget about some of the lessons that we need to learn from the past and apply that going forward. All right. Hope it's helpful for everybody. Again, this is day 858 going live. I hope you all have an amazing day. Hope you spend some quality time with your family and friends today because that's what life is all about.